Believe it or not, it's been 8 months since I first sat down with today's guest, journalist and author Reah Bravo. In our last conversation back in September, we discussed her book Complicit, How Our Culture Enables Misbehaving Men, which is now available both in hardcover and a brand new paperback edition with a new preface. You can find a link to grab a copy in the show notes of this episode. Since that first recording, it's hard not to feel incredibly frustrated watching abusive men continuing to rise in positions of power. Our very president, Donald Trump, has been found civilly liable for rape and has been accused numerous times for sexual assault, and yet he still holds the highest office in the land. Andrew Cuomo, despite the allegations that ended his career as governor, is currently running for mayor of New York City. Conor McGregor was also found civilly liable for rape and accused multiple times of assault, and he just launched a new business and announced a run for presidency in Ireland. Hell, Bill Maher even gave a platform to infamous Woody Allen on his podcast recently, for Christ's sake. It certainly feels as though the brakes have been pumped on the MeToo conversations happening culturally. There seems to be less and less resistance when these men rear their very ugly heads. There's so much to talk about, and I knew I wanted to talk to Reah to get her unique perspective on this. That's exactly what we're doing on today's episode. We're picking up right where our last conversation left off. So stay tuned right here on the Preacher Boys podcast. Reah, thank you so much for joining me.
Great to be back.
It's been 8 or 9 months, I think, since we recorded our first episode together, which my time with all these is so off, where I go, was it 3 years ago? Was it like three months ago? And the reason I had you back, and I'm starting to have a lot of people recur, is I have these great conversations, and then I never speak to these people again. And I go like, why don't we keep this discussion going? And especially with your book, Complicit, How Our Culture Enables Misbehaving Men, I don't think we put the period on that conversation. It seems like misbehaving men are being enabled left and right. I mean, what do you make of the culture right now?
Well, I see something terrifying, right? I see, I know we've been in touch with regard to the ascension of certain men or their comebacks. And, we could sigh in disbelief and leave it at that, were there not a political context in which all of this is happening, in which the current anti-feminist backlash that we are in is just happening with such fierceness. The rise of authoritarianism, of fascism in the US, that is part and parcel with patriarchy, right? Inherent to fascism is a belief in the inherent superiority of a social group or an inherent social structure, right? So I don't find any comfort in what we're witnessing in an administration that is attacking women on all fronts, whether it's cutting research funding that is designed to benefit women's health, whether it's research that's designed to advance gender equality, whether it's attacking companies for trying to promote and hire women or people of color. It's within that context, the return of people like Andrew Cuomo, that he even has a chance after so many of the accusations have been levied against him, and after his tenure as governor wasn't even that great. I think you can make a pretty solid argument that he had a lot of failures when he was governor of New York. All of which is to say, it's very overwhelming, and it's often, as they say, hard to see the forest through the trees, and to understand that this is happening all around us on all fronts, and it's not just a matter of a few perpetrators. It's like a system-wide attack that I think we should all be alarmed by.
I look at someone like a Cuomo, where, like you said, was not a great governor by any stretch. Obviously has a big legacy in his family that's made him a very powerful name in politics. But I mean, until Mamdani really had funds rolling in to have a shot at even, and who knows where that will go. Right now, luckily,
Mhm.
Cuomo is trailing by double digits. It seemed like he had it in the bag. Like it seemed like this was just going to be an immediate return. And what was jarring to me, I mentioned the interview with Lindsey Boylan. Like when I was prepping for that, I was like, most times when these guys come crawling back to power, they're going, 30 years ago, I had a moment of indiscretion. With
Mhm.
him, it's 2021. Like,
Mhm.
this is within the last 5 years, I had to step down for sexually harassing 13 plus people that worked for me. And now I've got a really good shot at becoming mayor. Like, when you see that stuff, obviously you wrote an entire book on this, you've been deep in research on this. Does any of that shock you anymore? Or does it just feel like, yeah, that's what I expect at this point?
I would say both. I would say both. It sometimes the Democratic Party can continue to shock me, in in who they fail to endorse, and in the second chances that they're willing to extend to people like Cuomo. Now that said, yes, I did. I spent multiple years immersed in the research, how entrenched patriarchal thought, what exactly is internalized patriarchy and how do we manifest it in our lives. And our notions of what constitutes male leadership, it runs really deep. And I think we have a really hard time just outright rejecting kind of our prototypes of male leadership for something significantly better, even when the facts speak for themselves. I unfortunately, I think people see a strong man like Cuomo, and they just kind of think that's what's necessary for the times. Now, what certainly I think we also have to account for is, I don't know if you want to call it trickle down misogyny. I mean, it's just like the Overton window, let's say, what is considered an acceptable, male political candidate it's sadly changed a lot, because whereas I am horrified that Cuomo, I mean, I know polls are looking good in favor of Mondani. Well, I'm horrified that he even had a chance at a certain point.
Right.
I think when we have a president who, um, you know, had a close relationship with Jeffrey Epstein, who signed a birthday card to Jeffrey Epstein with a message that it's really hard to argue isn't a reference to anything other than pedophilia. Um, Guys like Cuomo are more likely to get a pass. They just inevitably, everything is judged relative to the behavior of others. And so sadly, whereas I wish more people were aghast by Cuomo, and I think quite a few people are, but suddenly, the alarm bells aren't sounding quite as loud as they should be.
Yeah, that comparison game of like not as bad as, like, well, Trump is horrible, but he's no Hillary Clinton, was like the thing everyone was saying. And vice versa, I'm going to support this person because they're no Trump. And,
Hmm.
then you look at a Cuomo and an Eric Adams, and it's like, well, the pool initially doesn't look great for New Yorkers looking to cast a vote. Um, I am curious, like, in the wake of, I would say, a period of education in the Me Too movement where we learned so much about men in power, we learned so much about how culture does enable these types of men. It seems strange to me that the immediate aftermath of the Me Too movement seems to be this really regressive resurgence toward like toxic masculinity, just to use a blanket phrase. I think of the growth of the online manosphere. I think of the huge uptick of Gen Z men turning more conservative, attending religious services more than women. The women, of course, have fled religion largely for obvious reasons with all the abuse scandals that came out during Me Too. Why do you think we're in this period that feels like a real drive to conservative values in the wake of a period that should have woken everybody up to go like, how do we prevent the next Harvey Weinstein or the next
Hmm.
XYZ, fill in the blank?
Hmm. Well, we're here we're here because historically speaking, there have never been advancements in women's rights without a significant backlash, right? So for my own well-being in this really terrifying moment, I like to remind myself that things are as dark as they are because there had been so much change. You know,
Hmm.
our perception of the gender binary, our perceptions of gender are dramatically changing. And that's why the backlash is as fierce as it is. I think it's commensurate. I know we've talked about there is more mindfulness, there is more awareness. People are using language in ways that they haven't before to describe their workplaces or power dynamics between them and an older male. So despite that, though, there is the ongoing backlash. And I like to think for my own benefit that things are happening not despite the Me Too movement and all the change that, came before this, but things are happening because of it. And that we ultimately will find ourselves in someplace better.
Yeah, that pendulum has to get to the middle at some point, and hopefully it's a better middle than where the middle was accepted just a couple decades ago. One of the things that there is a huge blowback to, and this is a spoken, sometimes you look at things you have to analyze, like, well, why is someone behaving this way? But we have the benefit of a lot of male podcasters and conservative influencers that are outright saying that one of the big pieces that they disliked about the Me Too era was this, cancel culture idea, and, I'm sure we could talk a long time about that. But I think one of the questions coming out of Me Too that I'm hearing a lot is there a path forward for these people who were canceled? I think of Senator Kirsten Gillibrand, who initially called for Cuomo to resign. Then she later
Mhm,
downplayed those feelings, saying this is a country that believes in second chances. And you
mhm,
look at other public figures in non-political positions, like Louis C.K. was canceled in 2017 for masturbating in front of female peers. And now he's released 4 comedy specials, one of those at a packed out Madison Square Garden arena. So
mhm.
first you can just argue, were they ever really canceled? But I think the next piece of that is, you know, for people that are feeling a resistance to that, that are saying like, well, you can't just erase this person from the zeitgeist. What's your response to those kinds of comments or pushback on this movement?
Yeah, I have a lot to say on that because that's a question that's emerged since the beginning of the Me
Yeah,
Too movement, right? Kind of like, what do we do with the perpetrators, and
almost
can
in
we?
tandem with it starting. It's like,
Yes, yes, and it's a question that sometimes I really resent the framework of it because frequently it's it's framed in terms of like women's forgiveness. Kind of like it puts the onus on women. Like we're in this situation because if only we could understand that occasionally things happen, or if only people could learn to forgive. And the fact of the matter is forgiveness takes two parties, right? It's not just about the victim learning to forgive her abuser, but it's, usually the abuser doing something and working that warrants forgiveness and working towards it. And I was recently asked about forgiveness, which is part of, this conversation about cancel culture and, can there be a return? And I was asked about it at a book event because somebody wanted to know, like, what would that look like? You know, can it happen? How frequently does it happen? And I said, well, honestly, I have talked to so many people who went on the record during the Me Too movement or people who just wanted to talk to me about abusive bosses. And I know of one. I know of one case in which the perpetrator reached out to the woman and addressed the topic of forgiveness and if there was something he could do, right? Like I sometimes feel like this conversation is putting the cart before the horse. Like, I mean, especially for so many of the high profile men who have so many
right.
like finances on the line. And, I just, I don't, anyways, I don't I don't see a situation in which true forgiveness is being sought. I also feel like in the current context of so much cruelty in the world and so much cruelty under the current administration, I have a really hard time caring. I have a really hard time caring about men who have a lot of money, who just want another chance, another crack at whatever they're good at. If they make it back, if they claw their way back, like I just, I, I don't. They are okay. They will be okay. Like their livelihood is not on the line. But also, I would say that despite the fact that there is no like one size fits all rubric for how to judge each case. In the end, the people making the decisions about whether these men can return, it's not the public. It's the CEOs. It's the heads of for-profit or um, companies that were keeping the men in power when many of them were aware of their behavior. And they are making the decisions to keep them out if they don't want them. I mean, in a
Yeah.
world of limitless talent,
Yeah.
these many of these men they don't necessarily warrant a second chance.
I think that's true when we think of like the institutional guys that are running larger companies. I think of the Fox News,
Mhm.
situation or things like that. But in terms of, say, comedians or, influencers, the people making the decision of whether they come back is the consumer. It's, do I want to watch this YouTube video? Do I want to listen to this podcast? And I have to say, companies making decisions that are kind of gross doesn't surprise me. It's
Yeah.
concerning to me when I see hundreds of thousands of young men continuing to listen to a podcaster with, these kind of allegations swirling around them, or to pay for comedy shows, or to pay
Mhm.
for
Mhm.
fill in the blank. Um, that's the part that's really concerning to me. And it seems like that's the hardest demo to reach because I think they're so solidified in this, like, it's more important that we, like, us platforming this person is sticking the finger to this cancel culture
Sure.
title that we've
Mhm.
been programmed to
Mhm.
push back against,
Yeah. Or sticking the finger to wokeness.
Well, that was kind of Bill Maher having Woody Allen on. I
Mhm.
think his shield for every conversation he's had in the last year is, well, I talk to anybody. And everyone else is scared of a conversation. I'll talk to anybody. I'll chat with anybody. And, that's that kind of culture war that's clouding the way these situations are handled is just so prolific on the left and right, where it's like I'm going to talk to this person just because I know it'll make the other side mad, which is no shortage of Cuomo's support, is like, we're going to stick the finger to Trump because they've got this weird rivalry in public, potentially not a rivalry in private. But, when, um, I mean, do you think we're too far gone in terms of like trying to extract like the political side of this, like that back and forth fight of like, because even the whole cancel culture label, I don't even like saying it because I think it affirms something that's not really there, but that
Yeah.
is the politicized language that's kind of going back and forth.
I feel like if we're talking about politics in the US, I feel like we're too far gone on a lot of fronts.
Interesting.
Maybe not just that one. Um, yeah, and 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 you're right. What do we do? I mean, some of it I think also speaks to kind of streaming options and all of the avenues that misogynistic voices have today to maintain an audience, which is a bit terrifying, which is to say nothing of AI and the whole new frontier that that's creating. Um, but yeah, I I s- I don't see an easy way. I don't see an easy way out of it for sure.
One of the things that's become really important to me, and I think it's because it's so concerning to me, is I'm seeing this again, this new generation of young men, Gen Z and even Gen Alpha at this point, which it seems wild that we're already moved on to another generation. I'm seeing them consume this content from whether it's Fresh and Fit, whether it's an Andrew Tate or Tristan, or go down the line of these names. It's concerning to me because, when I was growing up, it was like you're going down the rabbit hole of feminist owned compilations and, but it was the algorithms were a lot less finely tuned, where like you would stumble across that stuff or your friend would show you something that's really funny, and you'd watch
Mhm.
it. And now that pipeline is so quick to where, my wife mentioned this the other day because she was looking up some Andrew Tate videos to see what, some people were engaging with. And she's like, my feed is packed with his content now. And I get it all the time. How do you think we reach that generation with these messages? Because like they're not. I'm looking. I'm like, they're not going to sit down and read a book about toxic masculinity,
Yeah.
and based on my analytics, they're not going to listen to my show. And I've tried to breach through with that with some of my content and try to make some things directly aimed for them. But there's just like they're kind of just bred with this resistance to these conversations. Any insight on that?
Well, I think of the work of Laura Bates, the British feminist journalist she wrote Everyday Sexism, and she's had one of her more recent books that I have just started. And now that you've asked me this question, I wish I had completed. But she delves into AI and just the fierceness with which young boys are fed misogyny. They just don't even have to go looking for it. Like their algorithms can identify, their age, their sex, their vulnerabilities, and feed them content that is going to be sexist. It's really, some of her work is really, I keep saying the word terrifying in this interview. um, but to say it is, it's really terrifying. So I don't see how, and I know it's always a debate, like, do we need like a Joe Rogan of the left, or do we need, I think one thing we definitely need is some sort of regulation
Mm,
and um a way to control or to limit the content that reaches young
right,
men. Because my understanding is it's not just as simple as, just even content that speaks to traditional norms of masculinity. It is content that is explicitly misogynistic in
right,
nature. So that, and that's part of what makes the current moment, it's such a struggle to see the path forward, because we're facing so many situations and so many technologies, right? That,
right.
I say in my book, like, never have we been at a moment where we don't know what the world is going to look like in 10 years. I quote the Israeli historian Yuval Harari. And, I feel like so much of that is like, um, yeah, it's a struggle to kind of imagine, how do we overcome the current context in which tech giants are not serving our interests, and
Yeah.
certainly not serving the interests of gender equality.
Yeah. Well, especially when the people who are, I mean, these oversight committees are so politically charged where, there's going to be a hearing talking about social media and how it can have an effect in radicalizing. And in light of the assassination of Charlie Kirk. But if you look at the list of people going to it, you have the CEO of Twitch, you have the CEO of Reddit, you have the CEO of Stream with the gaming side of this. But you would expect when we're talking about social media platforms that are radicalizing, the CEO of TikTok, Meta, Twitter, but notably, all of
Mhm.
those that are being supportive of the current administration are not going to be present at this. And if any platform is radicalizing people, I mean, scroll through X for all of 10 minutes and the rhetoric there, it just seems like even the checks and balances seem to be very, you know,
And
politicized and
I would go further than that. It's not just the checks and balances that are failing us. It is the norms and the messages that are coming from the top, right? Like we saw the head of the US military, Pete Hegseth, retweeted a white Christian nationalist minister saying that women should not have the right to vote.
Mhm.
I mean, it's not even the guardrails that are the problem. Although I do wish we had more of them. It's also the fact that currently our country is in the hands of some especially misogynistic people.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you mentioned Pete Hegseth, who attends a church connected to Douglas Wilson's ministry, and Pastor Douglas Wilson from Idaho. And he recently went viral with a CNN interview where he simply referred to women as the type of people that people come out of. And do you, I mean, one, there's the religious side of that, right? Which we could talk about. I mean, churches platforming a Cuomo just a couple weeks ago, but also you just see the way that women are labeled. I think is something you were kind of, alluding to earlier. Is like you see not just toxic masculinity reinforced through lifestyle, but it's also, I think, a fresh and fit referring to women as, 304s, and which is, I literally Googled and was like, oh, this is the stupid upside down calculator thing that means you're calling them a hoe. And that's an acceptable way for you to say it. I was like, that's not being funny in like fourth grade. And then you've got people like Douglas Wilson that are using this very utilitarian language that assigns a label to women. In this
Mhm.
case, for something that they provide, a
Mhm.
service that they provide. Do you think that hearing those labels, even if we don't accept them, even if we kind of like shirk away at them, do you think that kind of numbs all of us as a culture to violence committed against women?
For sure, for sure. I think it also, I mean, we know that we judge our own morality and behavior relative to what we believe is the morality and behavior of other people. Um, so, you know, when we see men making comments like that, when we see them given, a national platform to make comments like that, inevitably things that should have made us gasp before no longer make us gasp. Like, I am sure if my husband did not make it home in time a single night last week, to help make dinner, he's probably going to feel a little less lousy about it, about his contribution, if he knows, if he's reminded of the fact that there are a lot of men out there who actually just view me as like the woman in his life made to give him, right? It's
That
just
comparison game comes back in.
yes, and everything is relative. I mean, it just shifts, it just shifts the culture in a direction that we don't want to go.
Yeah. Well, I'm that's one thing that's interesting is I'm kind of curious. It's recent enough, even when this comes out, but the Charlie Kirk Memorial, for me, I could talk about for hours, but w- I guess one looking at that situation, does that concern you for the direction things will go and the way that's going to radicalize young men who were consuming this content? But also beyond that, I'm really curious, like the hypocrisy, like the hypocrisy of the organization itself to be a platform built on saying things like women begin losing their market value after 30. That was a quote directly from Charlie Kirk, which I'm sure people will be upset about because direct quotes seem to not get a lot of positive attention. But then he got married to his wife when she was, past 30, was older than him. He tells them not to pursue a career and that they should stay home and work there. That should be their priority. But now his wife is being established as CEO of this massive multi-million dollar organization. Like, I guess the twofold question, like I said, is are you concerned about where this goes in this moment that seems to be capturing the attention of so many young people and just everybody in general across age brackets? And then also, do you think this has legs when there is such a disparity between what they're preaching and what they're actually practicing right now within their organization.
Yeah, well, I will say the Charlie Kirk Memorial was the first time in a long time that I had to just turn off the news. It hit me in the stomach. It just made me sick because it, to me, was so flagrant that our president and his administration were capitalizing off of his violent, unfortunate murder to instigate violence, to take his death as an opportunity to clamp down their iron fist even, harder than they already have, and to incite violence against people who might be in opposition to their policies, or simply people who do not look like them or, you know, conform in the ways they would like them to. So, where we go from there, I guess we're all kind of holding our breaths to see. Yeah, it's scary. And it's scary in a country that has as many guns as the United States does. When you have a leader who, again, I mentioned earlier, we're in a time of, ever since Trump first came to office, a time of norm breaking, right? We have this tragic act of political violence. And rather than try to unite the country or assuage the country, we have a president who who goes on the attack and who wants to use that to incite violence against his own rivals. So I think, yeah, does it have legs despite the hypocrisy? The hypocrisy of their lives hasn't held any of them back before from achieving some of their objectives. So I guess we'll see.
Yeah. Do you perceive any? Because I've been arguing with a couple people lately. I mean, I grew up very religious, and I know the power that a martyr story has. And, I mean, the amount of mileage they got out of the reporting on the Columbine story, through my youth, I go back to that. And the way they turn that into this story of the Christian faith and martyrdom and standing up for what you believe in. And not about gun violence. That was never a part of the conversation. But I see this moment, and I believe that, I mean, there's a huge swath of young men who are going, people hate me. They hate the 30 and under white Christian man, and this culture wants us dead. And they believe that hook, line, and sinker. And, my I believe that we're going to see all of these numbers shoot up. Like the Gen Z slowly returning to church, I think is going to go up immensely. Leaning conservative is going to rocket even higher than it already was trending. But a lot of people I'm talking to, even people that are in this space and cover these things the same way, are going, I just don't see it. I don't see it having legs. Like they don't have women, they don't have children to carry on the mission. But I'm like, a lot of bad things can happen in the next 30 years without having, we're not talking multi-generational,
Yeah.
cult. I'm talking right now. I mean, how much do you think there's validity to that concern, or how much, or do you see it as like, this is a flash in the pan moment that will be forgotten in a couple weeks?
So, a couple of things. You, as we know, a lot of people who identify as Christian right in the US actually don't go to church. They are just culturally
Right.
identify as Christian right. Then they agree with whatever policy platform that they believe is Christian right. They are anti-choice. They are pro-family, having the wife at home, what have you. What concerns me, and I think if there is going to be a growth in, church attendance has been going down in the United States, right? Which, better than anyone, some of the problems that arise with organized Christianity in the US, and that can arise. But that said, churches for so many Americans, that's their only community. It's their only sense of community that they can find in their town. So there is something also dangerous about church attendance going down. Um, Now, I will say though, we have a specific problem in the United States when it comes to or specific threat, I would call it, when it comes to the Christian right in terms of both its power, its organization, and kind of the coherence of its teachings. I'm going to reference a book, and what I mean by kind of the coherence of its teachings, a book that I know I had recommended to you in an email by Talia Lavin. She wrote Wild Faith, which, for people of my demographic, um, it's easy for us to kind of. I had always grown up regarding the Christian right as somewhat more organic than it really is. Just kind of like, yes, we have like very fervent Christians in the United States. And, I have extended family that, might fall into that category. But the extent to which her book documents kind of the rise and power and the successful organizing and the popularity of, specific books and teachings that have been promulgated throughout Christian right communities that I was unaware of. And I say that also, I mean, what I should have said from the from the outset is that I grew up in a church. I grew up in the Presbyterian church. My father is a minister. He is also a fan of my book, and the last book event I had at home in New Mexico, I mean, I think half the audience was from my church community, right? I know that Christians in the United States are not a monolith, but I also think that we are remiss not to recognize the threat and the danger that the Christian right currently poses to democracy in the US. And so, circling back to your original question of what happens in this moment in the aftermath of Kirk's death, if there is an increase in fundamentalism and in people moving to the Christian right, I assume we're going to be able to credit it to the tenacity and organization and finances of the Christian right.
Well, it's the people that they become evangelical or become Christian because of political alignment. They're not pursuing, like, I think the way that you see in a healthy way is like your religious beliefs, your worldview influences your politics. Like there are
Mhm.
people who, if you're looking at, say, someone who's a progressive Christian, they would say, well, this expresses itself in me voting for social programs that do feed the hungry. And like that's something that flows out of my religious beliefs. And the trend I'm seeing now, and one of the reasons on a deeper level, like the Kirk Memorial concerned me is I saw such a variety of faiths represented in that, like as subsects of the Christian faith to be very specific,
Mhm.
where I saw concerning Catholic figures that I follow, concerning Protestant figures that I follow,
Mhm.
more charismatic figures that I follow, all dropping the barriers between their religious groups, like people who quite literally would call out the others for false doctrine a few weeks before are now
Mhm.
all linking arms and saying, we are a monolith. We all stand for the same Jesus that this person represents.
Mhm.
And that's an interesting switch to see, is that kind of ecumenical approach to like, we're all aligned in our politics and that's enough. And I don't think we've seen that happen at that large a scale in one moment. Like to kind of go, well, yeah, we're all together because we agree trans people are really gross and women should stay in the home and
Mhm.
down this line
Mhm.
of whatever main talking points are at that time.
And
It's a
also, I
weird,
mean,
weird place.
take this moment, Eric, to give yourself a pat on the back. I mean, your podcast, your podcast could not be more relevant,
Yeah.
right? I mean, maybe you thought it was somewhat niche at a certain point in time, but I certainly think it couldn't be more poignant.
It's that makes me feel really good, but it also makes me feel really bad because, I look at moments like this and I go, these things are so thinly veiled
Mhm.
and to the point you feel like you're grabbing people by the shoulders and shaking them and
Mhm.
going, hey, like, look at this. They're not even hiding this. and
Yeah.
it doesn't seem to make a dent. And I'm curious, you wrote a book about workplace sexual harassment, and even the larger culture of sexual harassment and abuse. I've been podcasting for 5 years. Do you ever feel like, did I make a dent? Like, because I feel that, like when you say that, I
Yeah.
truly appreciate it, and it means a lot coming from someone who's talking similarly. But I also, like, I look at the last couple weeks and the comments of people on my show, even people who've followed for a long time, that are going, "Oh, now you're taking a bridge too far. You're seeing somebody that's not there." And I'm like, have you been listening for 5 years? Like, have I been
Yeah.
speaking a different language the last 5 years? Like, how do you cope with that as a creator?
Oh gosh, that's a great question. I will say that as a creator, I take enormous meaning from the moments in which you hear something from someone that is positive, right? Like
Yeah.
I'll never forget, we were looking for, you know, my book took like 4 times longer to write than it was supposed to take. It was not I knew it was gonna be hard, it was so much harder. It was just and it was at a difficult time in my life, right? There was a pandemic, I had small children, it was just like the sacrifice that went into it, and I'll never forget, we were looking for the ARC, the advanced reader copy had gone out to some people, and I heard from a woman who read it, who sent me a thank you because it had helped her process her own abuse, and she just had some very lovely words, and it was like, suddenly, just one woman, and, like, those 4 years had been worth it. Like, it was just to let those moments wash over you is
Yeah.
is one thing I try to do, and otherwise, I know it can be really disheartening, especially when you feel us backsliding into
Yeah.
territory that is as misogynistic and as dark as it is. I think I just try to tell myself that makes what we do even more important. And because I'm sure you hear from people, as you just heard from me, these have been really dark, dark months, but I can't tell you how often I hear from people who are like, "Oh my gosh, I was just thinking about your book. Like, what's not applicable to your book these days?" And I'm like, "I know." Like, a part of me is walking around with my head exploding constantly because it's just like everything I see is in the context of patriarchy
Yeah.
and just the absurdity of the deference that's given to these, like, as you described them, thinly veiled, you know, men and their their self-serving objectives.
Yeah. Yeah. It
Yeah.
like affirms, it almost affirms like the thesis of your book, or affirms the thesis of the stuff you're putting out there, but you don't want it to. And so it's kind of
Mhm.
like, I talk about these systems, and then you see the system still working. You go, "Ah, I wish I
Mhm.
wasn't right about that system. I wish I didn't know where this was
Yeah.
going." Yeah.
I will say that what I think about more and more is, at the end of my book, I emphasize the importance of imagination, like in fighting our own internalized patriarchy and systems that we need to be able to imagine a world that's different from the one that we live in.
Yeah.
And I have to assume, I mean, I think about that a lot and how important it is. I still call myself out. You know, I I have to assume too that a lot of the world is changing, and I'm not going to make excuses for bigotry or for people who support racists and misogynists and convicted rapists in office. But I will say that I imagine the absence of an alternative vision of the world, the absence of something other than patriarchy that is good and beneficial, it only leaves them more entrenched in what they know
Yeah.
and clinging on to the the cruelty that they know rather than, open themselves up to something different.
Right. Yeah. Uh, Do you think moving forward, there's a way to not, 'cause I mean, I wrestle with this too. Is like, I can be snarky and I can point out the obvious things, and I can, dunk on, the the wrong side of some of these things. But I also read so much about cult literature and how to communicate with cult members, and like saying you're in a cult, or immediately addressing this overarching thing only drives people further back into it. Or if we're talking on the religious side, perceived persecution affirms that we're headed the right direction. Like, the world hates us, we must be doing something right. Um, how much do you feel responsibility to like couch your language in a way that's like educational, informative, and prescriptive in some ways, versus like, okay, I just need to say this is a cult, this is super wrong, like regardless of your intentions, you voted for a rapist who did X,
Mhm.
Y, and Z. Like, because I go back and forth, and I think like the majority of people who voted for Trump, who I won't say the majority, but the majority of people I've talked to who voted for him literally are like, I truly believe that he's going to do what he says about the financial state of the country. I believe there's people that don't like that and have falsely accused him. I believe that the left is trying to take him down. And like, from their perspective, he hasn't done the things that he clearly has done. And it's like, that's
Yeah.
a weird conversation to have.
Yeah.
How do you
I mean,
think we can engage in those?
yeah. Okay. So that's a kahuna. So yeah,
As we get
it's
near the
that
end, let me drop
sensation.
the big
Yeah.
bomb question.
Well, no, it's kind of the sensation of us, are we living in this like post-truth world? I had a friend down the street who told me, a fellow American. I live, as you know, I live in Belgium.
Good
And what
timing to be outside the country.
I know. Yeah, I'm well aware of my privilege. So this friend of mine, when Trump was reelected, it was like, let's um just wait, give it time. When people begin to truly feel it, when they are hit by his policies, when they begin to suffer economically, when, this happens and this happens, they will change their tune. And he was actually kind of hopeful, this idea that like there will be a pendulum swing. And my immediate concern had always been, in this particular media environment, how w- w- how do we know that a Trump supporter understands why they are suffering, or why their
Mm,
grocery prices have gone up, or it's really concerning. It's really scary to me, and it's scary to me that now we have the so many media companies that are owned by Trump loyalists, and also, so it's it's a difficult one. I will say that, and maybe this is relevant to your question of language and how do you speak to them. I think the most important thing is that you do speak to them, because fascism thrives, authoritarianism thrives on isolation and lack of community. So whatever language you're using, I think it's good that we speak, and we do talk to these people. Um, but specifically, as far as the language is concerned, I think about this because I realize sometimes at book events, or when I'm being interviewed about my book, you know, sometimes just dropping the word patriarchy or gender binary, I see that people
mm,
have this reaction, kind of that I'm already way out there.
yeah.
And they don't expect to connect with anything that I'm saying. So yeah, I mean, I do sometimes, I will do things like I will follow my language up with a description, what I mean by that. So it's, when I talk about how I think the gender binary is the linchpin in, well, I don't just think that. I take this from feminist philosophers and feminist psychologists who argue this, who know more than I do, but is like the linchpin in the injustice that we're facing. And that if we could address that, we we could more broadly address injustice in its myriad forms. When I say gender binary, I follow it up with the idea, that that we have inherent roles based on our gender. I expand on it because I find that otherwise they take it to assume that basically I'm talking about trans athletes. Like I don't know, or that I'm talking about, which yes, maybe I am, but I'm talking about something so much bigger than that.
Right.
And especially in this time of I don't even know if culture war does it service to call it a culture war, but in this time of just these issues that are just, you know, made into such unbearable sticking points. Yeah, it's really a challenge.
Well, I really appreciate having this conversation, and I know we could talk a lot more, and I'm sure we will because there's so many things. Like every single thing that we hit, I'm like, well, that could be an entire episode because there's so many layers to this. I guess if you could say now, I mean, you obviously wrote a new preface to your book, Complicit, and I'm sure even that as you're writing it, you're like, I could add this and I could also
So it's
add
hard.
this thing. You know, sitting right here right now, recording September 25th, 2025. If you were to add something to your overall messaging that you included in your book and say, like, I want to communicate this thing to people listening right now, what
Mm.
would that be?
Wow, that's a question. Well, fortunately, what I would want to communicate to them is actually in the new preface. I might expand on it a bit more, but it's the notion which I take from the feminist psychologist Carol Gilligan that the task right now is to separate democracy from the patriarchy. And as she explains and has explained, when we seek to understand the current moment and Trump and his authoritarianism in terms of democracy, it's disorienting because he and all of his principles actively subvert democracy, and that Trump is operating on the paradigm of patriarchy. And so that patriarchy is crux to understanding the current moment. Um, by which I mean, the shame that we've been taught to endure and the cruelty that we're taught to condone. That's that culture is is what gives rise to someone like Trump. That's where his staying power lies.
Well, I want you to pat yourself on the back because that message is more timely than ever. Thank you so much for doing this again. I really do appreciate it. And I hope it's not the last time we chat.
I hope not either. Thanks, Eric.
You've been listening to the Preacher Boys podcast hosted by Eric Skwarczynski. The intro music, Bible Belt, was performed by Lou Ridley.
I said, come on, we are gathered here today to praise the Holy Father, feel the glory of his name. Anyone can worship here so long as you act straight, pay your tithes and follow rules, even the ones God didn't make in the Bible.